RealAg Live, everybody, here on this Tuesday. Hey, thanks a lot for tuning in today. Really do appreciate it. It's a busy couple weeks here across the country, but also around Ottawa. And we're going to find a little bit of some of the things that have been going on. I want you to participate in the program today, of course. That's what makes this program so much fun, so unique, is that we not only do this live with our guest, but we also incorporate your questions and comments. But in order to do that, you kind of have to participate. So you can do that through YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or Twitch. You just enter your comment or question in the box of the program that you were on, or if you are watching on realagriculture.com at realagriculture.com/live. The questions we read today, I'm giving away these hats. So that's pretty kind of a cool incentive to participate. Let's get to today's topic. Last week was Grain Week, and this started on Friday, carries into this week. It's kind of a virtual setting, I guess. It is the FPT meeting, and we're going to find out about all of these happenings from somebody completely in the middle of all of it. It is Erin Gowriluk from Grain Growers of Canada. Erin, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, Shaun?
I'm doing good. Okay, I guess let's start off with this. Last week, maybe pause. Talk about who the Grain Growers of Canada are. That's a better place to start.
Okay. Grain Growers of Canada is a national association celebrating its 20th year. I've been the executive director. I've had the privilege of serving as the ED for the last 2 years. We represent about 65,000 grain, pulse, and oilseed farmers in every province across the country. And our members are, for the most part, provincial associations, some regional associations, and we have one national association as a member with the Canadian Canola Growers Association.
Cool. Last week was what you call Grain Week. It was pretty cool. I got to participate. On the Monday, there was the call where we talked about, you showed a video, we can talk about that in a second.
Sure.
We talked a lot about trade, and so Carlo Dade from the Canada West Foundation gave a presentation. And I got to then interact with Carlo and ask him a bunch of questions. It was a lot of fun. What is the objective of Grain Week?
The objective of Grain Week is to put more farmers in front of policymakers more often. And although the idea was born before I joined the organization 2 years ago, I think about the fact that I'm here in Ottawa, interfacing with policymakers on a very regular basis. But, as someone who doesn't, look, I wasn't born and raised on a farm. I don't farm. I don't have a lot of street cred. And so while I can go in and talk to policymakers about what our farmer priorities are, the best way and the most effective way to deliver that message is to put farmers directly in front of policymakers. And so we were doing that twice a year, typically post-harvest, pre-seeding. So we'll do this again in February. And it would often involve bringing the farmers here to the nation's capital, and we'd hit the hill for about 4 days. It looked a little different this year.
Yeah, and the reality is there are people like yourself, that are working in these organizations, doing a lot of the lobbying, but for whatever reason, maybe you can explain the why of it. The MPs really like to hear from farmers and sort of from the horse's mouth, so to speak. What I guess it makes sense to me because those are the people that are actually impacted by some of the things that you're bringing up all the time, right?
Well, exactly. Farmers can tell the story. It lends credibility. I can tell them the impact that it's having on Canada's grain sector, but farmers are there to tell the story, and we know that's most compelling. And so that's what they do best in our meetings. And I think that's what lends the greatest impact when we're having those conversations with policymakers, like we did all week last week, like we continue to do this week, is tell the story.
Yeah. And so what is that story right now? What is the focus? Of course, BRM, I'm sure is a part of that. But what are some of the stories and the things that you're talking to MPs on, not just in government, but on the opposition side as well?
Well, we always have a theme for Grain Week, and this week's theme was growing back better, building on the government's plan to build back better post-COVID. We're talking about growing back better in the sense that, look, we know that agriculture as a sector is well positioned to drive the post-pandemic economic recovery. So if that's the case, what do we need to be doing with our government partners to ensure that can happen? And so when we had that conversation with our members through our various policy committees about what do we need to be working on with our government partners, we had a few priorities under, and it won't come as any surprise, Shaun, international trade, for example, and market access issues, innovation, and sustainability. And the sustainability was a unique one this time. It was more of a challenge pillar in that we were here to ask government about the comments that was made during the throne speech with respect to wanting to work with their farmers and ranchers across the country as partners in the fight against climate change, recognizing the efforts that they've made to date. And so one of our questions around that particular pillar was define recognition. What does that look like from the government's perspective?
What did you hear back?
Well, I can't say I've emerged with a very clear sense other than a renewed commitment to do just that. So there is a commitment to do that, but we don't know yet what that looks like. So we're working on that. But
Yeah.
that was sort of what encompassed Grain Week this year. It's a little different every year, but that's what we were doing this year.
So, a lot of the guests we've had on, you ask the standard question. It's sort of like it feels like you have to ask it: is how has COVID impact your job? When I think of sort of lobbying, you think of some pub and some side street in Ottawa and trying to work a networking session and trying to make sure you get your message across to people. It's not really reality, so to speak. How has all this changed for you?
Well, that to a certain extent is still happening, as much as we're permitted to do that with the MPs who are here in town, because they're kind of coming in shifts now. But, the silver lining to this pandemic has been, and we saw that last week with Grain Week, is that we are able to reach a broader audience. One thing I can tell you in the meetings that we had, I think as staff and as farmer directors, we were quite surprised at the level of engagement with the MPs, senators, and government officials through those virtual platforms. I mean, nothing beats a face-to-face meeting, but the level of engagement was surprisingly high. And the nice thing about that is, typically at this point now, here we are on the Tuesday after Grain Week. A lot of our farmer directors, all of them would have left the nation's capital by now. Well, anytime you have a meeting that's postponed or canceled, typically you've lost the farmers. They've gone back to their respective, regions of the country. Those meetings continue into this week and next. And we can do that because we have a virtual platform. So many of the same farmers who are participating in Grains Week last week are joining our Zoom calls again in the weeks ahead.
How many Zoom calls have you averaged a week through all of this?
Well,
it's a lot.
There was one day in particular where we had 7 meetings. And that's the other thing. You can do more meetings because you're not running around, the hill. You're not jumping in and out of a cab going from building to building. You can go back to back. One of the drawbacks is just when you think you can physically have, manage 7 meetings in one day, it can be a little exhausting.
Yeah, and is a part of it when in meeting with MPs of all different political stripes, is a lot of it just sort of getting back to the basics and trying to explain here's what the issues are that farmers are dealing with across the country. And of course, food has become so much more of a prevalent topic during COVID, as especially in the early days, March and April, where shutdowns first started. Will there be food on the shelves and all the hoarding that was going on and things like that? But it's really trying to just get across to them, here's why this industry is important, just so you know. Is it that basic?
I think to your first point with respect to COVID and the conversation that's currently happening across the country around food security, maybe that is part of the reason why engagement levels from MPs and senators were so high. Everyone we talked to wanted to, if they couldn't fit it into their schedules last week, find a time to connect with Canadian farmers. They wanted to take the meeting. So I think that there's a renewed or heightened sense of awareness around the issues around agriculture, and that was evident last week. So that's a good thing. It means that we have the opportunity to put more farmers in front of policymakers more often, and we continue to do that.
As you mentioned, there's meetings still ongoing this week. The first day of the FPT, the Federal, Provincial, Territorial meetings, was last Friday. Then it carries into this week. I believe the intention is for it to be wrapped up by Friday of this week. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Their last meeting will be in 3 days.
Okay, so what goes on that's a week between meetings. So what's happening in interim? Like I yesterday there was a presentation that was given. Kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and tell us what are some of the things that are happening in the meantime in between those 7 days.
Sure. We had an opportunity to, myself, on behalf of Grain Growers of Canada and our partners with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, the Canadian Pork Council, and the Cattlemen's Association, we did have an opportunity, a rare opportunity, to appear before the FPT Ag Ministers yesterday and present a united front around one particular issue, which is our number one priority in terms of what we want the Ag Ministers to be focused on this week, and that is improvements to business risk management, in particular agri-stability. What happens between the conversation we had with them on Monday and their final meeting on Friday, I hope, is whatever wheeling and dealing has to occur to drive everyone to consensus. And so they're coming in with different perspectives and positions. Hopefully, they're taking that time between their two meetings to work to drive to consensus so that we have a favorable outcome, especially with respect to BRM from this Friday's meeting.
I would think in the Zoom world, back to one earlier question about what lobbying's like in these times when they're doing it remotely. I would think it's a little harder to find consensus because you have a little bit less of that. Like, can I just talk to you in the hallway for a second? We need to sort this out. You have less of it. It's not conducive to sort of consensus building discussion. Is that fair?
It may be fair. And we see that with our own interactions with government when we're working on Zoom. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we'd be riding in the elevator, we're making our way through security in a particular building on the Hill, on your way to meet with someone, and you run into 3 or 4 other individuals in the hallway and have those sidebar conversations, right? And those are just as valuable. So to the extent that that's happening with this year's FPT, no, not to the same extent. I think an effort would have to be made to reach out and have those conversations. And so we hope that in that 4-day period that exists between the two meetings, that an effort is in fact being made to do the additional outreach required to drive to consensus.
So who drives that trying to find the consensus on the BRM? So Ontario is hosting. So does Minister Hardeman? Does he chair the meeting and try to is he sort of he's leading hey, okay, that's great, that's a good point, but what about that? Like, is he doing that, or does a third party come in, or does Minister Bobo fit into that role? How does that work?
Minister Bibeau certainly fits into that role. And I would argue that everyone has a role when they're trying to drive to consensus. And so, for example, on an issue of business risk management where you have joint jurisdiction or shared jurisdiction between the provinces and the federal government, I think it's everyone's responsibility. If you've got some provinces who say, okay, you know what, we're on side with what sector stakeholders are looking for here. This is an ask that we can support. If there are other provinces who can't, tell us why that may be the case, and let's see what we can do together to alleviate some of those challenges so that we can get everybody a little closer to the middle. So I would argue that it's everyone's responsibility to try and drive to consensus.
A question here from Kara. Grain Week is an important time. How do we continue to tell the story as grain producers throughout the year? As someone who lives in southern Alberta, I'm a long ways away from Ottawa.
We have found interesting and creative ways to do that. And that the pandemic has presented a challenge and a real opportunity. So, I've got to give you real kudos, Shaun, for the fact that you do what you do every day. We have got a podcast now that we're doing. It's Fireside Chats with yours truly. And it takes me 2 or 3 weeks to organize for one conversation. So the fact that you pull this off every single day, I admire that. So we've tried to find creative ways to keep the conversation going between policymakers and our farmer members. So the podcast is one way to do that. When we sit down with government officials or industry partners, our last one was with Minister Ng. And so that will be shared later this week. That will come out. We solicit questions from our farmer members, and we bring those questions to the conversation with government officials. So that's one way. And hopefully some of our farmer members were listening to those conversations when they were out in their combines this fall during harvest. And then we found other ways, like we were doing every few weeks, we were hosting a roundtable with government officials and our farmer members and staff so they could dial into the conversation. And it was a nice roundtable conversation for 45 to 60 minutes. So you find creative ways. And one of the benefits, like I said, is that you have more member engagement. So last week with National Grain Week, for example, never before have we had that many farmers directly involved in outreach and advocacy. They could do that because they could join in from wherever they were in the country.
So historically, agriculture talked to the ag minister. How much of your time is spent talking to some of the other people in cabinet? So you mentioned trade. I would imagine the not treasury, but finance minister, not treasury secretary. I'm thinking about the U.S. Finance minister, or maybe health. Talking to are you talking to those other portfolios as well? Okay.
Absolutely, we are. Of course, there's so many that touch agriculture policy. We're talking to those ministers. We're talking to those ministers' staff. We're also talking to the folks who sit around the committee table. And so, for example, we had one of our objectives was, and that continues this week, is to have a conversation with every member of the House Trade Committee, because our issues related to international trade and market access are a priority. And so we want to make sure that when those decisions reach the committee level, we've had a conversation with every one of those MPs who sit around the committee table. And you could apply the same to, the Agriculture Committee, the Transportation Committee, the Health Committee. Those are all important conversations.
How do you talk to the provinces? Grain Growers of Canada is a national organization. Clearly, it makes sense you're talking to Minister Bourbeau in this example. But are you also sitting down with the provinces? Like I'm thinking back to the consensus building on BRM. Mm-hmm. Are you trying to connect? Sort of bring the parties a little bit closer through your messaging?
Our members do a good job of that. So they're well situated. They have the relationships with their provincial agriculture ministers. And yes, there is certainly a level of coordination that exists because we're all working towards the same goal. Is certainly with respect to business risk management, we're trying to move everybody in the same direction. But we do look to our provincial members to engage in the conversations with the folks with whom they have already established relationships.
Yeah, so it's definitely a multi-pronged approach.
It is.
Okay, well, hopefully by Friday, we'll know more about BRM and what that could possibly look like, and hopefully it is not another. We'll talk about it in July.
Exactly. We've done that a time or two before,
Please.
And I would argue that the response would not be favorable. It's really high time for the ministers at both levels to come together and do something. So.
Go ahead.
We're hopeful. That's all I can say at this point. We'll have to wait and see. And hopefully there is a decision, and it's the right decision Friday afternoon.
If they do kick the can, is it sort of time to reconsider from a farm group perspective? Sort of like, hey, we need to focus on something else. Like, can we continue to chase? Can this be our number one ask for 6 more months until the next meeting? Like, is it that kind of moment in time?
Well, at some point very soon, the conversation will begin. We will start having the conversation internally with our members in terms of what has to happen with respect to, I don't know if we're going to call it, CAP 2.0,
right.
But the next framework. What are we looking for in the broader suite? So we'll start that conversation early in the new year. But I think we'll have to wait to see what they come back with. They will have to provide some type of response to the sector, specifically around agri-stability. So I think we'll wait to see what they have to say and react to that.
Question here from Lindsay. Lindsay, you mentioned market access. What are the biggest hurdles right now for Canadian grains?
That's a great question. Without getting into commodity specifics, because I think we're all well aware of what's happening right now with respect to key markets, with respect to, durum wheat into Italy and pulses into India and other key markets like China. I think that one of our key messages around market access in particular, back to government officials over the last week and a half, has largely been around the need for, whether you want to call it a policy pivot or a reset, but we collectively as a country need to rethink the way in which we're approaching international trade. So we've done a very good job, I think, at establishing free trade agreements. This government has, the previous Conservative government has. They've had a very ambitious agenda. I think now we have to do a couple of things. First, we have to ensure that those free trade agreements that we do have in place are living up to their full potential. So they have to be fully implemented and enforced. And then I think that there are some other things that we can do when we look at key jurisdictions around the world. We have to ensure that we have boots on the ground. I think that was a term that Carlo Dade used in our conversation when he was presenting the research that he did specifically around agriculture in China. Boots on the ground in those key markets to ensure that those teams are poised and in place to deal with any issues as they arise before they become significant market access issues. So we're asking the government to take a step back and ensure that the resources they have are put in the right places right now.
Carlo, he brought up this boots on the ground thing, and he made it very clear. It's not just about having government people on the ground in some of these markets. It's also about having it's the responsibility also of the people who are the companies trying to sell into those markets. We are very understaffed across the board. He was really concerned. It was a real focal point for him. I've heard this from some others as well. Do you share that concern?
Absolutely. Yes, I do. And many of the officials who were placed in international markets around the world in light of the pandemic have had to return to Canada and have not returned necessarily. Not all of them have returned to those key markets. But you're right, it is more than just government officials. I think we have to look at the relationships that our industry partners have with other partners in those key markets to ensure that they're well positioned to respond to any concerns that they may have. Because that can very often, I think, be just as if not more effective than government to government. When you're having those industry to industry conversations that occur in those markets, they can be just as effective.
Well, the different responsibilities too. Like I think of a government person, it's a technical person. It's there to answer questions. It's there to interpret what some of the market access issues will or could be.
Mm-hmm.
A company rep is there to sell product. They have different responsibilities when they're on the ground. That's how I would kind of read it.
Yes, and I think that was one of the things that came up in our conversations. And this is one that we've had not just with our own members, but with the value chain, with all of the major value chain associations as well, who work directly on issues that you're talking about with respect to trade is, a technical issue requires a technical response. A political issue requires a political response. And so one of the things that we've been asking government to do is when we're looking at issues like canola in China, for example, let's ensure that if it's a technical issue, if it's a political issue, we're not employing a technical response, right? Let's ensure that the response is appropriate for the challenge that we're facing.
Yeah. I'm going to throw you a question completely out of left field here. I was thinking about this earlier today. I was having a phone conversation with somebody, and the question was in regards to the Barton Report.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, okay, like the Barton Report is constantly mentioned. Oh, the Barton Report. Oh, the Barton Report. I hear it all the time from politicians and stakeholders. Are we doing really enough as an industry and as Canadian? Are we doing enough to sort of enable ourselves to live up to what some of the opportunities as outlined in the Barton Report?
I think as an industry we are, and I think we're trying to engage our government partners in that conversation. I think one of our jobs as an industry is to clearly define where we need to be working with government to advance some of those objectives and then work collectively with our government partners to do that. I was just on a panel with the Canadian Chamber this afternoon talking about this issue with respect to reducing red tape and regulatory reform and modernization. And there are examples in other countries around the world where, you've got Denmark, for example, that has a forum that exists where you have a conversation, a very regular conversation with key industry stakeholders and the government on a very regular basis, talking about the impact that regulations are having on a sector's competitiveness and profitability. And we have done that work. To a certain extent, agriculture has done that work. Like you mentioned, it was identified in the Barton Report that we're continued with the economic strategy roundtables, right? I think we've done a very good job at clearly identifying the problem. I think what seems to be lacking now is the political will to take it across the finish line.
And why is that? Why are we having such a hard time? Because we just talked about how we had great attendance from MPs and senators, and they're all coming in. They want to hear what's going on in agriculture. but we
Yeah,
we still we still can't politically get things across the goal line. Those two things, it doesn't add up to me, Aaron. What the heck's going
I
on
know.
here?
And that's not an easy question to answer. But one of our farmer directors, I really liked, we were talking about this very topic with an MP. And one of our farmer directors was talking about the important role that innovation plays on his farm and science-based, evidence-based policy. And he said, in order for me as a Canadian farmer to have access to this technology, I need some assurances that government policy is going to be evidence-based, science-based. And by that, I mean actual science, not political science. And so I think while we talk about the value of science, and we've certainly had those conversations through COVID, I think that we have to bridge the gap between science and data and what that tells us and the conversation that we may be having with consumers. And I think there's a role for industry to play. We need to do a better job, I think. And by industry, I include growers, for example. We have to do a better job talking about the benefits that those innovations, for example, bring to the farm and make that connection to the things that consumers are looking for and the benefits that can be found when you have access to that technology and innovation. But I think our government needs to do a better job as well, talking about the safety of these products. We saw that not that long ago when the government had a statement on the reevaluation around glyphosate, and they came out with that statement that said, "We left no stone unturned." I think government needs to do a better job talking about the scientific rigor that's involved in the decisions that they take to protect Canadian consumers.
Got a question here from Brian watching on Twitter. Brian's going to get himself a hat because I'm going to read his question. Number one, Aaron, what are your thoughts on the private members bill introduced today that would restrict any trade agreements that affect supply management tariff rate quotas? I think that was a
I
private
don't
members bill that was out of the block, wasn't it?
well, we don't represent the interests of the supply managed sector. So, we represent the interests of grain, pulse, and oilseed farmers who, for the most part, see about 80% of their product going into international markets. So we want to ensure that through this process of negotiations that they continue to have unfettered access to these key markets. I don't think we want to see anything stand in the way of those negotiations. So I'm not going to comment specifically on the role, how that impacts the supply managed sector. I'll let them speak to that.
Right. Well, and I'm not. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see where that private members bill goes. All the
Mhm.
parties politically have promised. If you go back to the last election, both the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Liberals all sort of put a flag in the ground and said, you know what, any future trade deal will not include giving up market access for
Good.
dairy. We'll see how they deal with this private members bill, which is very much along those lines.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on the UK transition deal that was signed here over the weekend?
I think that it was the appropriate response to ensure that we have continued access to an important market. I think that there is a hope and expectation that both parties will come together soon to negotiate a more comprehensive deal. But I think in terms of having an interim deal in place, I think it was the right response at this point.
When it comes to the EU and UK, we obviously we hear about canola into the EU, but we talk a lot more about Asia when it comes to some of the grains. But hey, Warburton's big, they're a big purchaser of Canadian wheat, so it just doesn't get a lot of headlines though. That being like a market of great focus, but there is some trade to be done into that region.
Mhm. Yeah, there is. And I think you're right. It's not one of our biggest markets, but I think right now we need to protect any market access we currently have. That's key.
Right, exactly. What is the where is what is the next big trade? Like when you're talking to government, they talk about, hey, where do you see some future trade opportunity? What are you telling them? Are you saying to them India? That seems like I'm not sure either of us have enough time in our career to complete a trade deal with India.
I
Um,
think when we're asked that question by government right now, like I said before, it's not that diversification isn't important. Of course it is. But we need to ensure that the free trade agreements that we currently have in place, whether it's, the comprehensive economic trade agreement between Canada and the European Union or it's the CPTPP, that they're living up to their full potential. And we don't want to see resources taken away from ensuring that that happens and dedicated exclusively to diversification and exploring FTAs with other countries. Let's ensure that the deals we have now are living up to their full potential. That would be our response, I think, to that question right now.
Yep. Tara Sawyer watching on Twitter comments, market access is important, whether with existing countries, but also in opening new markets. I appreciate the comment, Tara. I'll definitely be sending you a hat. I greatly appreciate it. But she's right though, right? Like it's like Canada's an exporting country. And of course, there are a few commodities that do not focus on trade. But if you look in that exportable commodity group, that fit under CAFTA as an example, that if we didn't have trade, we would be a fraction of the size. We couldn't survive without it.
No, we couldn't survive without it. 80% of, depending on the commodity, about 80% of the commodities that we represent move into overseas markets. That's the international marketplaces where many of our farmers derive their livelihood.
Yeah. Does the Grain Growers of Canada have any position on where we're going with the potential? Like don't have the details yet, but the clean fuel standard. Is there any position there?
The position at this point right now is, you're right, we don't have the details. We have been assured that it will be presented through Canada Gazette 1 on or before December 20th. So we are keenly interested in seeing the details. There's potential there. I'm not a technical expert on the issue, but we know that there is potential there. So we're waiting and watching, and you will hear from us shortly after December 20th.
Someone well, Ted Menzies, he's on RealAg Radio this afternoon talking about responsible grain. It's kind of the grain equivalent, or the best comparison would be the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. What do you think about that project?
We're involved in that project. We have some farmer members who have a representative from Quebec, Manitoba, and Alberta who sit on the advisory council or committee that has informed the group's work. So we are going through all of the work that they've done over the last year. And I know Ted will be talking specifically about some of what's in that plan, that code. And so I think it's I think it's been very good to have farmers a part of that process. I look forward to taking a deeper dive into some of the work that they've done. And I think that it has the potential, I think, to be an effective tool to demonstrate, certainly to international markets, just what happens here in Canada with respect to sustainability measures. I think it's a show and tell project. I think it really has the potential to demonstrate we're doing good things here in Canada. Yeah.
Okay, so and that's the benefit that you see, is that it allows us to kind of like, hey, look at this, look here, look what we're doing. We're tracking, we're establishing. Here's how we define responsibility or sustainability on grain farms across the country.
I think it does a very good job at telling the story. Absolutely.
Okay, and based on your work you've done, that's important to export markets like Japan or the EU and countries like that?
It is important. We're hearing that it's becoming increasingly important. And so if we can have a way to kind of quantify that, we know we're doing good things. We know that farms are becoming increasingly more and more sustainable. And so if we can find a way to quantify that and to tell that story to international buyers around the world, that's a good thing.
I'm going to ask the question because somebody's going to say, why didn't you ask this question? Am I going to be paid more? Does it mean I'm going to get more money for my product because I can fit into these sort of parameters? Does it work like that?
I think it depends. And I think my response would be probably not. I don't think that there's any guarantee or assurance that there's going to be a premium attached to these products necessarily. But I think what it will do is it has the potential to position Canada as a preferred market.
Awesome stuff. Hey, Erin, this has been a lot of fun. I really do appreciate it. I want to mention that Devin, Tara, and Brian are all getting these very, very swanky Real Agriculture hats. So I really do appreciate their comments and their questions. Erin, all the best this week. I'm sure we're going to be talking later on in the week as details begin to be hopefully rolled out on if there was consensus found on BRM. Are we? I guess I'll finish up with this. Are we still hopeful that consensus can be found?
We're always hopeful. And that should be what the ministers are working on right now. They have a few days to do that, and hopefully they will do right by Canadian farmers, and we'll see a favorable outcome on Friday afternoon. And I would look forward to talking to you about that.
Awesome stuff. Erin, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Shaun.
Okay, I want to mention to everybody that today on RealAg Radio at 4:30 Eastern, as I said, we do have Ted Menzies from Responsible Grain on. We're also going to hear today from Peter Wheat Pete Johnson about selecting that variety for 2021. Today's radio show is actually brought to you by SeedNet, so check them out at seednet.ca. I really appreciate Erin from the Grain Growers of Canada joining us. This is a big week for ag lobbyists, and you make sure you go to realagriculture.com. We're going to have a full breakdown of some of the developments. The stories come out each and every day. We're talking to all of our sources, so we're on it, and we're your place to get all that insight, I promise you. Okay, thanks everybody for getting real and getting connected with Real Ag Live, and we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.